Hello.
See everyone again today. Welcome to the third day and second day of our academic conference panel, co-organized by African Studies Group and Melbourne Social Equity Institute. We are very delighted to have all of you today, and we appreciate your active participation in this conference thus far. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation on which I work and live. And I recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and community. I pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge that sovereignty on this land has never been ceded. I say this in solidarity with their ongoing struggle. So before we go, I wanted to introduce the panel chair today. And after that, I will hand over to her to take the rest of the activities from there. Stéphanie Kabanyana Kanyandekwe is a Rwandan British composer and multidisciplinary storyteller and a broadcaster working between now Melbourne and Rwanda. Multiple forms of synesthesia add a neurodiverse dimension to Stéphanie's identity as a third cultural individual. Stéphanie's research-based practice explores the construction and archiving of culture through transcription into experiential narratives. Stéphanie's work focuses on layered and nuanced sensory engagement in installation and theatrical performance settings, referencing Rwandese storytelling styles alongside contemporary artwork, music techniques from tertiary training in composition and performance practice. On this note, I hand over the panel to Stéphanie to run it the way you deem fit. Thank you, Stéphanie, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and welcome and good morning to everybody. I'm coming to you from Woiwurrung country, next to the Merry Yallock, also known as Merry Creek, right here in Naarm, Melbourne, and extend as well my respects to elders past, present, and the formidable ones emerging and leading us into the future, and also resonate with Matthew's words in showing my solidarity for Indigenous peoples. Always was, always will be, Indigenous land. So this session this morning on day 3 looks at research. We have a number of fantastic panelists to bring their thoughts to you today. We start with Simeon Gready, then following Simeon's presentation, we have Donatien Niyonzima, as well as Kriti Bhuju, 2 panelists who join together, and finally with Festus Moasun. The way that I'll run today's proceedings is each panelist will give you their presentation, and then at the end of that individual panelist's presentation, we'll have a 10-minute Q&A, so you can address any questions to them directly. Then cumulatively, at the very end of our session, after our third and final presentation, not only will we have a Q&A for him, Festus Moasun, but we'll also have about 10 minutes or so if you've got any final comments or questions that come to you a little bit later that you'd like to address to any one of the panelists, or perhaps all of them together. If you'd like to ask questions, please drop them into the chat as they come to you, or hold on to them for when we open up to the Q&A section. Right now, I'd like to start off with handing over and introducing Simeon Gready. Simeon is a PhD candidate in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He is researching the role of the African Union in transitional justice initiatives of its member states, and has published on transformative reparations and structural socioeconomic reform. Simeon has been a member of the African Studies Group since his first year at the University of Melbourne. And his presentation today has the following title: Who Gets in the Room? Expertise, in inverted commas, and the Politics of Knowledge Production in Transitional Justice Contexts on the African Continent. Over to you, Simeon Gready.
Thank you so much, Stéphanie. I'm just going to be sharing my screen with you all. Thank you for also acknowledging the inverted commas around expertise. That's something to keep in mind, I think, as we go through some of the slides as well. I tend to make overuse of those inverted commas. I would like firstly, in addition to acknowledge the fact that I'm speaking from unceded Yagara Jagara and Yagara Paul land, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Thank you all very much for joining me today. Just to reiterate, my name is Simeon Gready. I am a second-year PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne. And so with that in mind, what I am kind of presenting here today, the kind of framing of what I'm presenting can be framed as kind of preliminary findings of my research. It's a kind of small section of my broader PhD research. I'd also like to kind of directly look at this topic in relation to the theme of the conference as well. So solidarity in diversity, particularly kind of considering highlighting marginal voices within policy framing. The way I'd like to do that is to speak to the role and scope of expertise within transitional justice context on the African continent. By examining how expertise is framed and utilized within transitional justice policy framing and engagement as well. So in that way, this is a discussion on the politics of knowledge production. So essentially kind of what knowledge is valued and foregrounded, which agendas shape the scholarship and practice of transitional justice, and also the profound consequences that this has on transitional justice policy and practice as well. There are roughly two broad sections to my presentation today. It's necessary to consider the historical development, first of all, of transitional justice as an assemblage of ideas and actors and actions and objects as well. And that section I've termed the imbalance and violence of relations between the global south and the global north. I'd like to thank Brian Kagoro for that term. Secondly, I will discuss a case study, which is a real kind of central lens through which my PhD is conducted as well. And that's the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, something that I'm going to expand on a bit later on. And the framing of the ATJP is the way in which it exercises epistemic agency and pushes the frontiers of transitional justice as well. Just briefly as well, I've got at the bottom of that slide a definition of transitional justice taken from the ATJP for those who don't study it quite as closely as I am at the moment. So transitional justice refers to the various formal and traditional or non-formal policy measures and institutional mechanisms that societies, through an inclusive consultative process, adopt in order to overcome past violations, divisions, and inequalities, and to create conditions for both security and democratic and socio-economic transformation. So it very much involves things like truth commissions, such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, for example. It involves things like reparations. In some cases, there are prosecution kind of circumstances as well. All of this is kind of encompassed within what we now know as transitional justice. So firstly, I'd like to talk about how the politics of knowledge is kind of produced, how it's shared, how it's rendered legitimate within transitional justice. And this really kind of depends on the relationships and the interaction between a number of different epistemic communities. And by epistemic communities, I mean kind of networks of knowledge-based experts. These are largely considered to be professionals with, here we go with the inverted commas, recognized expertise, as well as an authoritative claim to policy relevant knowledge. We've also got within transitional justice the kind of myriad context to which, or in which transitional justice is embedded at local, national, and international levels. All of this kind of plays a role in the ways in which knowledge is produced, is shared, and is also kind of rendered legitimate within transitional justice contexts. It's important to note how how expertise has been defined and utilized within transitional justice for most of the last 20 to 30 years or so. And largely kind of traditionally, expertise is seen as professional and internationally mobile knowledge. It's really important how the knowledge is kind of diffused worldwide, kind of globally, is internationally mobile, rather than knowledge that is situated actually within activist communities and knowledge of local contexts. So that is to say that the internationally mobile knowledge, that which is kind of diffused around the world, is often prioritized above actual knowledge of the local context within transitional justice circumstances. What this has meant within transitional justice is that a dominant script of best practices has come to shape transitional justice. It's often delivered as a kind of toolkit of transitional justice, which really struggles to adapt to different contexts, because it's often the same toolkit that has been delivered within certain transitional justice contexts around the world. Additionally, what this also means is that forms of expert knowledge then tend to be legal, they tend to be foreign, and they tend to be based on models replicated elsewhere. And often what this means is that where they are legal, foreign, and based on models elsewhere, they often tend to be based on Western examples as well. And Brian Kogoro calls this transitional justice's knowledge imperialism. And that is the production of knowledge on and for transitional justice is not a practice that different actors have been afforded the equal opportunity to engage in. And in that way, overwhelmingly, the production of knowledge, again, on and for transitional justice, really continues the unequal power imbalances and the violence of relations between the global South and the global North. And we can look here again at a quote by Fletcher and Weinstein, who state that major funders, policymakers, and researchers working on transitional justice are mostly based in Australia, North America, and Western Europe, while the sites of transitional justice practice generally are found in Africa, Asia, and Latin America as well. I think it's important to note here that also that this kind of expertise is often delivered in a number of kind of euphemistic ways. It can be called a kind of technical assistance approach. Technical assistance being kind of what is considered to be specialized knowledge within the field of transitional justice. This is the way that this expertise and this knowledge is delivered to global South kind of context from the global North. And this has led to a kind of overriding assumption within transitional justice, and it's one that really kind of percolates a lot of the kind of literature and a lot of the practice of transitional justice as well. And this assumption, you might take note of a lot of the air quotes here again. The assumption is that the sites of transitional justice require the technical expertise of Western funders, policymakers, and researchers in order to overcome their legacies of large-scale conflict and systemic human rights violations. So what I'd like to move on to now is to look a bit more at a case study, which for me is the kind of central argument here that really disproves this assumption. This is the African Union Transitional Justice Policy. The AUTJP kind of started its development in around 2009. It took a full 10 years to get to what ended up being a 26-page policy document that was then unanimously adopted by all African Union member states in February of 2019. It was a long process. From the interviews I've done so far, it was somewhat of a painful process as well. But in the end, they have ended up with this 26-page policy document. And the really important thing here is that the AUTJP was very much formed and coordinated through technical expertise based on the African continent. It was coordinated largely by a Cape Town-based civil society organization called the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And so they kind of took the lead and drove a lot of the assembling of technical expertise from different African contexts and different African actors to develop this policy document. The AUTJP, just kind of, if I can explain kind of quite generally, it is a policy guideline for African Union member states on transitional justice. It is a kind of a step beyond a lot of other transitional justice policy kind of documents, because it really emphasizes the African context of conflict and systematic repression. It emphasizes the role of local ownership of traditional African processes as well, and of the need for socio-economic transformation and psychosocial healing as well as part of the transitional justice agenda. I think this quote is particularly striking when it comes to AUTJP, which says that the knowledge drawn on for the making of the AUTJP is not a static body of knowledge, but rather has been assembled by and from a range of stakeholders, including, among others, local expert consultations and a broader consultation process. So these two activities, the drawing of knowledge from local experts and the broader consultation process, these two activities in particular can be recognized as epistemic practices. And it is the establishment and the use of the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation's own epistemic community as well. In short, what the AUTJP kind of represents, it represents African actors working through the African Union, using the continental policy space for advancing a really rich African perspective on transitional justice. It's also a kind of, it's a framework that in many ways pushes the frontier of the field, as I've got within this quote by Solomon Durso down here as well. It is interesting to note as well that a lot of the traditional kind of transitional justice experts, which would be international NGOs such as the International Center for Transitional Justice, have not reacted to the AUTJP too favorably. You know, for example, there is no mention of the International Criminal Court. There's not a strong mention of prosecutorial justice within the AUTJP. And these are things which have, up until now, really embodied transitional justice, at least from the perspective of Western-based organizations, international organizations like the International Center for Transitional Justice. So the AUTJP really is a step away from this Western-orientated transitional justice that has so far dominated the debate. Not only this, I think, but I think that there's also really potential for the AUTJP to actually be a norm leader in itself in terms of transitional justice globally. It really has the potential to disrupt the imbalance and balance of relations between the global north and the global south, and also influence transitional justice discussions in countries within the West, such as Australia and the USA, where many would argue that there is a desperate need for things like truth commissions and even reparations. And this is because of the way the AUTJP really embodies and also directly recognizes the fact that knowledge for transitional justice processes, both technical and contextual, is primarily situated on the ground and in activist communities, rather than flowing in as internationally mobile knowledge. So in conclusion, if my slide will move yet. In conclusion, I'd like to draw out a couple of lessons really within the context of this conference as well. So one of the sub kind of questions of this conference was, who has the power to include and what is the criteria for inclusion? And the central takeaway here within the framework of this conference is, I think, the way in which we consider the role and scope of expertise within policy framing engagements. Again, I think this quote is quite useful. So within a study on the AUTJP, Ulrike Ley stated that expertise is not a stable property of some professional international actors, but rather a resource that is strategically assembled by different stakeholders in order to meet the complex needs of policymaking. And this is to say that a greater diversity of voices, including marginal voices, can be represented when we are able to recognize that expertise is not the property of a privileged few. Such as international NGOs. And once we drop this idea, we can remove certain criteria for inclusion into these spaces as well. And rather, we must recognize the existence of a number of interactive and engaging epistemic communities, many of which are located within the Global South. Great, thank you so much. That's where I'm going to end here. I do have a last point at the bottom, which is just stating where my research is going to go next. And that's looking further at the Gambia, which is going through their own transitional justice process at the moment. So I'm looking at how transitional justice expertise has been assembled within the Gambia's own transitional justice process as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simeon, for your presentation. I think I can speak for everyone by saying I feel like I've learned a lot from going through your points. Kofi has just reiterated that, saying fantastic presentation, and Festus agrees with you too. Now we've got some hands up for your Q&A section. Matthew's put his hand up. Matthew, have you a question for Simeon? Perhaps if Matthew's not quite ready, are there any questions that we have for Simeon and his presentation, some of the points that he's raised today? We might go to Kofi. Your hand's up.
Yes, please. All right. Thank you very much, Simeon. As I said earlier, that was a good presentation. My question is, why do you think the AUTJP does not mention the ICC? I would want you to think of that in respect to the politics on the continent and how that might have fed into that framing, and how that also relates to the question of local interest. Whose interest does the AUTJP is trying to serve?
Great, thank you, Kofi. It's a very good question. And this speaks to also one of the reasons why it took from 2009 until 2019 to get the AUTJP developed and reviewed and written and eventually adopted by member states. So in 2009, if you remember correctly, that was the time at which the ICC indicted Omar al-Bashir of Sudan. Yeah. It was at this time, and even kind of beyond that, you know, throughout the next 10 years, that a lot of African actors have been really critical of the ICC and their role within international justice in the global sphere, for their, you know, what many would call kind of overreaching and almost a kind of hypocritical focus on African states, on African leaders, as opposed to looking at other states, you know, for example, the USA and their war crimes, or you know, the other war crimes of many other states and leaders around the world. The issue was that from 2009, and even before that, and certainly even beyond that, transitional justice was really intimately tied to institutions like the ICC, and it was really intimately tied to processes of prosecutorial justice. And so even just the term transitional justice within African contexts would often immediately end the conversation, you know, because there would be a lot of mistrust from African states, African leaders towards the term transitional justice, because they would simply view it as a kind of tool for the West to essentially put into jail their leaders. You know, that was kind of the long and short of it. So it took a long time, and this is really highlighted by Sophia Bray, who I interviewed from the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation a few weeks ago. She was saying it took a really long time to get the African Union member states on board with the term transitional justice, because they so intimately linked it with the likes of the ICC and with the likes of kind of prosecutorial justice, which, you know, if we look at the history of the ways in which African societies and groups have dealt with conflict resolution, it's not been in a prosecutorial way. You know, so and that's why the AUTJP really moves away from, I mean, yeah, but like I said, does not mention the RCC at all. And there is mention of prosecutorial justice, but you know, there is a lot more mention of kind of reconciliation and kind of working together to move forward as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. I would have followed up, but let me leave the floor. We can continue with our argument later. Yes,
there's always more to say, isn't there? There's always more to say in these moments, but I can see there are a few more people that have put up their hands. Thank you, Kofi, for your question, and thank you, Simeon, for your answer there. Franca has raised a hand. Franca, your question.
Yeah, thank you, Simeon, for the presentation. Really excellent listening to your presentation or your views on the politicization of knowledge production and expertise in that space. And this relates more to Kofi's question because we are our sort of PhD research look at Liberia a little bit. So I wanted a bit of your views on how that politicization translates to institutions like Truth and Reconciliation committees, and how there's a lot of investment into getting some of these programs up. But when it comes to actually implementing the supposed finding, nothing gets done. And I'm relating this to Liberia, where the country seemed to be stuck because all these findings were never actually implemented. I'm wondering whether there's a connection between that and your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thanks, Frank. So yes, and again, this is something that has come up in almost all of the interviews that I've been kind of doing so far, is that the AUTJP itself puts a lot of store in kind of setting up transitional justice processes. There is less on implementation. The last interview I did was actually last night with Professor Tim Murithi, who's based in Cape Town. And he, along with the AU currently, they are developing a guide manual for implementation for member states on the AUTJP. The implementation of Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations is probably inarguably the hardest part of the process. And this can be for a number of reasons, such as funding, political will, different political agendas, things like that. And, as you quite rightly say, this is where a lot of the politicization of these processes, kind of really comes into play as well. Tim Murithi last night, when he was talking about the guide manual for implementation, they're hoping to have that out and adopted by the end of this year. He was saying that one of the really important central kind of ideas that they're hoping to implement within a number of member states around Africa is to have the funding for transitional justice processes integrated within the national budgets of these states. Because the issue is, at the moment, the national budgets of a lot of these states don't have transitional justice budgets within their national budgets for the year. And so that, there is no funding to be able to pursue recommendations or to be able to pursue the implementation of these recommendations. If there is no funding, then there's also not going to be any political will as well to be able to actually pursue them. So, that's one of the steps that they are taking. We are going to be finding out more, hopefully, when this guide manual comes out. In addition, hopefully, I'm going to be finding out more within my research. As I said, I'm looking at the Gambia as my central case study. It's too early for me to tell about the implementation of the recommendations within the Gambia. The full and final report of the Gambia's TJ process is only coming out this month or next month. Hopefully, within a couple of years, I will have a much better answer to your question. Yeah, these are some of the steps that are being taken towards implementation of recommendations.
A great thumbs up from Franca there for your response. A message on the line from Matthew saying you may also find it useful to look into some of the procedural justice literature in terms of importance of voice and the inclusion of voice in processes that involve decision makers and how this empowers marginalised individuals in transitional justice. We have one last question that we do have time from Sahir. Sahir, are you there with your question?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much. Simeon, wonderful presentation. I also learned a lot from listening to you. My research has been in the area of the ICC and its investigations in Africa. So I just had a question about, you seem to be presenting the a distinction between transitional justice in terms of truth and reconciliation and so on, and prosecution. And I just wonder how, if you can speak to that a little bit more in terms of the ICC, given that African states themselves have been very much using prosecution to push for justice on the continent for large-scale crimes like crimes against humanity. And we see that in, for example, Kenya. We also see it in Libya and other places where African states are themselves taking up the call for prosecution as a response to violence, political violence. So if, yeah, I think, you know, you've got also, you did mention, so I think that dichotomy between transitional justice and prosecution doesn't always hold up if you take into account that, you know, you've had the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, you've had the Special Tribunal for Sierra Leone, and most recently in relation to Gambia, you had Gambia commencing proceedings in the International Court of Justice in relation to violations of international law, or rather genocide, to put it bluntly, against the Rohingya. So it seems that African states are themselves very much taking up this call for prosecution, but also at the same time using transitional justice to almost supplement their responses to injustice and violence on the continent. So I just wondered what you thought about that, if you could speak to that a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, you are right to certainly question the kind of distinction between prosecution and transitional justice. I can sometimes probably be a bit kind of strong in my kind of distinction kind of between the two, but just to clarify, I mean, within the AUTJP, there is certainly kind of mention or kind of benchmarks placed for prosecution within transitional justice contexts. It can still be part and parcel of the process. Where there has been a slight shift within the AUTJP from previous examples is that prosecution was often, you know, kind of first and foremost within transitional justice development. You know, whereas within the AUTJP, you know, there is more of a balance between the ideas of pursuing prosecution and, you know, the ideas of kind of alternative ways of conflict resolution and dealing with past atrocities and kind of legacies of past atrocities. And these are often linked to more kind of traditional African models of conflict resolution, you know, such as Mata Uput in Uganda, for example, which is, you know, a lot less focused on prosecution and is a lot more kind of community orientated healing and kind of processes like that. I think what's also really important to kind of emphasize here is that a lot of what happens within transitional justice, it's always dictated by where the funding comes from. And this is a really important kind of point to make. And again, this was emphasized in within the context of the Gambia as well, is that at this point, the African Union have stated their intention to provide a African Transitional Justice Fund for the member states. At this point, that's not activated. The majority, if not all of the funding at this point for transitional justice in Africa is still coming from overseas. It's still coming from places like the MacArthur Foundation, which is based in the USA. And the issue, as I'm sure many of you will know, is that, you know, where funding comes from overseas or where it comes from anywhere, it can often come with some kind of strings attached and with some certain kind of ideas attached to that. And often what is pursued is dictated by where the money is coming from. And so I mean I completely take your point that that there are certain African states and African actors that are kind of pursuing prosecution for certain crimes, and that is part and parcel of the process. What the ATJP emphasizes is more of a balance between prosecution and other potential, more traditionally local kind of transitional justice mechanisms.
Thank you for that question to Sahir, and also to Simeon for your great answers and clearly stimulating a lot of thought today. If you continue to have some questions, don't forget you can pop them in the chat and hold on to them for the very end, where I'm going to try and make space for some final thoughts. Right now, we are moving on to our next presenter or presenters today, as we have a duo presenting for you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Donatien Niyonzima and also Kriti Bhuju to go through who they are. Donatien is from Rwanda, and he's a doctoral candidate at the University of China, the Institute of Communication Studies. He's also the research associate at the Africa Communication Research Centre and has extended experience in media and communication in both the private and public sectors. He holds a master's degree in international communication from the University of China and has worked as a communication consultant in a number of different regards, as well as being a journalist and later at the central government office of the Prime Minister of Rwanda. His research focuses on new media, artificial intelligence, gender and media literacy, as well as media diversity, political communication, and international communication. Lots of foci there. He's presented papers and published a number of research articles in these areas of interest. And currently, right now, Donatien is working on the area of artificial intelligence and media and community radio, as well as gender as one of his main research areas, and has recently presented papers related to this in different international conferences. Very fascinating, as is Kriti Bhuju, who joins us, who's from Nepal and a doctoral candidate at the Communication University of China as well. Her research interests include gender and media studies, international development and communication, new media and technology, and media literacy. Currently, Kriti is doing research on the contribution of technology in the socio-economic development of taking case studies in Nepal, and the role of community radio as well. Now, both of them have a long list of accolades and achievements between, and so I really need to just hand you over to them right now so that they can present for you this particular section in our panel session, looking at presenting voices of the marginalised through communication research. It's over to you, Kriti and Donatien.
Good morning and maybe good afternoon for those ones who are on the other side of the world. This is Donatien Niyonzima, as you have just presented. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Thank you. I will try to share my presentation with you. Okay, today I and my friend Kriti Bhuju, we are going to present to you the research we have done together. It's presenting the voices of the marginalized through media and communication research. So marginalized people live on the margins of nation state, inhabitants, but not citizens. They do contribute to the economy, but they are ignored to the extent that they barely benefit from it. Some of them are passive, they live in loneliness, and they are excluded from society. These people can be overstayers, females, or they belong to a certain group of ethnicities. In academic research, in social science research, sometimes they are ignored, and this is an issue that is persisting to include them. It's an ongoing challenge for social science research, especially media and communication, where the interpretation and presentation of issues concerning their lives as participants are embedded in contextual situations, and actually it's given less voice or no voice. Our focus has been in this research to qualitatively explore how the voice of the marginalized are included in media and communication research, and what are the challenges of doing so or not doing so. On the basis of the expert sampling method, we have interviewed 20 writers and editors of books and communication on communication and media. Researchers have argued that to ensure the structuration within the society of any organization, different groups speak in different voices, and through those voices, they can get empowered. These voices, these voices in the case of the marginalized are suppressed or reduced in some particular context, such as social political ones. I was trying to just give you the context of what we have worked on. I would like to let my friend, my classmate, Kriti Bhuju, to take you through the findings and the recommendations we have come up with what we have been researching on about the marginalized in the context of communication research. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Let me continue with our findings. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kriti.
Yeah, okay. So let me continue with what we have come out with this research. We have done the thematic analysis, and this analysis identified two core dimensions of inclusion, that is mainly the representation and the voice. What we found is the engagement of groups and communities that are considered disadvantaged or marginalized by the social institutions. They can provide a platform for making their voices and concerns more audible and visible in any research agenda setting. And this can help address the epistemic injustice and generate research topics and questions that are more explicitly focused on including their voices. So on representations, like as I mentioned, we found two major themes, representation and voice. So in representation, it was defined by the interviewees as being present in any research paper, either directly, like representing themselves, like the marginalized, or indirectly being represented by the others. So interviews highlighted four aspects of representation. They are like who is represented in the research, how it is represented, in what context, and by how many. So when it comes to voices, like voices were defined by ensuring individuals have the opportunity to share their views, the freedom to say what they have think, and to have their voices influence what research priorities are set and how research is being done. So in our findings, we also found that like ensuring the voices of marginalized, the interviewer says that they promotes a way to strengthen the validity of any research. If the voices of marginalized are not included, the academic research will only be supporting and consolidating an elitist view is what they have mentioned. And in the context of China, where we are studying, the key for including the marginalized voices is to approach to the peasant and the workers. So when we talked about the challenges of including the voices of marginalized, they said that it's difficult to generalize theories from the marginalized group to justify the research result in the academia. So they also talked about the cultural and language barriers. Marginalized people feel difficult to express their problems. Most of their issues are the interpretation of researchers or some intermediaries. It raises the questions of bringing forth the actual voices. The enactment of research outcome is a major challenge, and mostly this was the most highlighted thing is the lack of publishers' interest and also the lack of the readers. So what we have found out the way forward is like placing more people from marginalized groups in the editorial boards might help. Call for special issues focused on marginalized people, less developed countries, provide more opportunities to the authors that are less represented in top journals, raising the issues of diversity and inclusion, especially the voices of the marginalized group, and priority settings should be designed to achieve the inclusion of disadvantaged and marginalized groups and community in any research paper. So to conclude our findings, this research, what we can say is that starting from the bottom or from the marginalized will deeply sift both width and depth of any research. It is important to bring research into practice. The results should be used to bring about the real change. Actually, the findings of any academic research are not implemented, and that's where the problem lies. Including marginalized voices promotes a way to strengthen the validity of research by ensuring all participants are active in the research process. If we can look for more funds and more publications that specially targets on marginalized groups, like for example, special editions, like I mentioned, and giving voice to all, reflecting more deeply on positionalities and representations of others. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any queries and questions, you are welcome.
Thank you so much to both of you, to Kriti, Bhuju, and also Donatien Niyonzima. So we can open up now to questions from our attendees today. You can either do this by popping in questions into our chat or by using the raise hand feature here on Zoom. We have an initial question to start off with from Vincent. Vincent, are you there with your question for Kriti and or Donatien?
Yeah, thank you, Stéphanie. Thank you, Kriti and Donatien, for such a collaborative work. It sounds quite interesting. What I just want to ask is, in terms of the voice of the marginalized, I think in your presentation, you did mention that it was quite difficult for them to express their difficulties. And I would just like to know if you could touch a bit on that. What does it really mean that it's difficult for them to know what they are feeling and what they are going through and how they feel their voices are being marginalized? So how difficult is it, or what if you could touch a bit on that, the difficulties in expressing their own difficulties and challenges? I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah, the question is clear. Actually, the research we have done, it was from the perspective of the researchers. We have talked to people who are supposed to be including the voices of the marginalized, even if we knew that actually those people are given less voices. And then from the perspective of our respondents, our interviewees, actually among the reasons why they gave not to be including enough marginalized people is that in most cases, those people are not easy to access, and they said that actually there is a need for more funds. The main point they have advanced is that is the difficulties in actually accessing those people who are marginalized. So in communication, if you don't reach the person who is supposed to be your source of information, who are those people to actually be able to include them in your research, it means you have not given them the opportunity to communicate what they have, what they to contribute to your research. So I think the answer should be to you should be that if they are not given the opportunity to communicate, their voice will be suppressed. Yeah.
Thank you for your question, Vincent. Have we any other questions for Kriti and Donatien on their research, or perhaps even the application of their research into some of our own individual practices and organisations? Maybe quite a few people deep in thought at the moment and still processing it. It is a very dense and rich topic. Donatien and Kriti, thank you so much for sharing it with us today. I'm sure, as you know, water to ground theory tells us, you know, we cogitate and you know, digest these things over time. People may come to you with questions at the end. So I'm going to try and leave space for everybody at the end of our session to have any questions and reflections for any of our panelists today throughout this particular session on research. At this point, we're going to move to our third and final panelist for the session. It's with such honour and pleasure I introduce to you Festus Moasun. Festus is an assistant professor of social work at the University of Regina in Canada, and his research interests include in brackets, disability, capitalised, mental health, decoloniality, politics of knowledge creation, immigrants and globally displaced populations, personhood, and the intersectionality of culture, oppression, and marginalisation. The presentation that Festus is going to give you right now has the title Colonised Ethics, Researching Vulnerable Populations in the Global South under Western Ethical Directions. Over to you and welcome, Festus.
Thank you. I would have to share my screen briefly, and if I would ask the host to allow me to share my video, I'll be happy. So if the host can allow me share my video, turn my video on. Yeah. Thank you. Just a few minutes for me to set up my slides, and then I'll be good to go. Okay. Okay, I hope my slides are visible for all to see. All right, so it's a strange time we find ourselves in, that you are presenting without seeing so many faces. It looks a bit dry, but I'll do my best. I would start by also acknowledging the fact that I am doing my presentation from Kitchener in Canada, and I am doing so from the lands of the neutral Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples. And I appreciate the opportunity to live and work on this land. As I been introduced, I am interested in decoloniality of knowledge creation. so to say. And I appreciate the fact that the organizing team put the presentations in such a sequence that it makes my work very simple, following from the presentation by Donitien and Kriti. They really dovetail into each other. So I'll be making a lot of reference to their presentation as I go on. So today I'll be talking about colonialism in academia, and then I will look at Western ethical requirements and their implications in some way for those of us who are working within Western institutions and researching, basing our research in the global South. I would highlight these things based on the Tri-Council policy statement of Canada. So the Tri-Council is a body of, a conglomerate body of 3 institutions that came together to chart a policy statement to guide ethical conduct of research. And so they present the directives as to what research passes to be conducted ethically on human participants. And so my presentation today, even though have global implications in terms of the Western directions that are given for researchers in the global South, is more specific to Canadian policy statements on how research is conducted. I would make a caveat that this presentation is not so that we are contesting the need for us to have our research vetted for its suitability to be conducted in certain contexts, but that when we do so, when we vet research, we should take cognizance of the fact that Western understanding of ethics is not exactly the same as Southern understanding of ethics, and therefore we must be context specific in the way that we approach approval of research studies. Now, when we talk about colonialism, neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, and all of these terminologies, it's late here in Canada. It's heading towards 10 o'clock, understand me. When we talk about all of these terms, often our minds are taken to political colonialism, governance, power, and etc. We don't often turn our attention to knowledge creation that feeds into all of these things of politicking and economic interactions between the North and the South, etc. So the purpose of this presentation is so that I draw attention to the need for us to start thinking about how to decolonize knowledge creation such that we would empower knowledge from the global South. Now, most of the time, the sources of power for the global North to control the global South is derived from their economic power. Excuse me to say that economic power that was stolen from the global South, basically. And so they have acquired that economic power, they have acquired the political power, and together with their cultural superimpositions, now control what is right and what is wrong in different parts of the world beyond their world. And these have been forged for a long time, since time immemorial. If you remember when they started colonizing the global South, that's when they started pillaging our knowledges and our resources to maintain what they call the global forces that are directing everything that happens, including research. Now, Said is a prolific writer on decoloniality, and he talks about the fact that when we produce knowledge production in itself is the exercise of power. And so a lot of the time, whatever is done in the global North to control what we do in terms of researching and knowledge production is an exercise of that power. at the end of the day, what happens when they control how we conduct research and how we produce knowledge, which is deemed acceptable or not acceptable, results in what we call the epistemological rejections. Basically, their knowledge is valid, ours is not valid, ours is not worthy of publication in that instance. And so at the end of the day, some knowledges end up getting ignored, some of them are rejected outright, and others are subtly silenced. And that is why I'm happy that this conference has been organized so to emphasize the need for inclusivity in terms of knowledge creation and all those other pointers of marginalization. Every time we do research, as research southerners, global southerners, operating from global north, we are gazed with a colonial lens. And that colonial lens is done such a way that if you don't critically analyze it, you won't see it. So I give you instances when as I do my presentation of how they have controlled and directed what knowledge gets accepted and what does not get accepted. So at the end of the day, every ethical approval process is aimed at, in their perspective, to create knowledge that is most efficient and workable. And that knowledge is workable because it is positively impacting the lives of the people when it is implemented. But you see, there is a certain expectation that that knowledge is obtained through an ethical process. But they've never told us whose ethics it is that they are using to judge the validity of that research. We must bear in mind that every whatever is considered ethical or moral is in itself cultural and belief dependent. So if people are judging the validity of my research, I mean the ethical safety of my research from a Western lens, when I'm conducting that research in a Southern context, to what extent do they understand the Southern context and the Southern definition of ethics, or what is ethical and what is not? So I give you a few excerpts from the Tri-Council policy statement of Canada to make a point for what the challenges are with us operating from here and conducting researches in the global south. Now they say we have to ensure that every participant gives their consent to a study. Consent is defined to be free, informed, and ongoing. That's important, and that can be universal. But what the problem is, we have to respect people for who they are, their dignity, etc. That's also universal, and that is important. And so voluntary participation, perfect. Now, the problem is, for me, who research in the global south, is respect for persons who also means those who lack the capacity to decide for themselves should have the opportunity to participate. That's exactly what Kriti and Donatien presented on. Now, we have to involve all those people who lack the capacity. Now, there's a condition to involving those people. The condition is that once they cannot give, they don't have the capacity, somebody else must grant that consent on their behalf. And that person must be authorized to do so. I accept that. But you see, the authorization must be done in such a way that there is evidence that this person has authority to do so. In the context that I conduct my research, you can get that evidence. That's the challenge. There is the aspect of privacy. My concern is the highlighted word intrusion. Privacy means that respecting the participants' avoiding any situation where you intrude into the privacy of the individual's space. So the privacy of their bodies, their personal information, their spaces that they occupy. That's very important. But in some situations, it is difficult to differentiate between the private spaces of individuals within a communal system and which present challenges for us as Southern researchers. The other thing is about confidentiality, that we must ensure that whatever information we collect from people we research must be held in confidence. We must protect that information from the public knowledge so they can identify who said what. That's important also. But we are obliged to report certain instances where we suspect issues of danger to either the participant or their environment. That's a challenge for us as researchers in the Southern context. And I will give us reasons why that is a challenge, reasons that are challenges are encountered in the field. The other aspect, and this is probably the last of the ethical issues that I will raise, and then I will jump into the practical challenges, is compensation. The Tri-Council policy statement says clearly that we need to pre-inform the participants that we are going to compensate them before they accept to participate in the study. So you cannot keep the information on compensation silent until the end. And then it says that compensation must not be unreasonable. It must be adequate it must be commensurate, not too small and not too much to induce the participant. So that in some contexts, it becomes pretty difficult to determine what is enough or what is too much. And I would speak to that. Confidentiality, so I'm giving you a few of the challenges that I face in the field. I would post a link to a podcast that we have had on this topic at the end of the presentation, so people who want to listen to it can have further insight into this. But confidentiality in a communal society is very difficult. It's difficult in the extent that sometimes people don't have their private spaces where they can have that confidential information. But also, for my specific experience, in the cultures that I have done my researches, people do not often host strangers alone. They have to have a third party present. And that had been a challenge between me and my ethics board, seeking to allow the third person to be present when I interview that interviewee. And so at the end of the day, the challenge was not to have this person there, but I thought that I wouldn't have anybody to interview going into an all strange environment without allowing these people to be there. It was a back and forth. I got my way with it because I had to justify, but it took a long time for me to do so. And as I've already said, sometimes you can't guarantee privacy just because as you're talking to somebody in their private space, another person is listening behind the door. But the more important thing is that in some situations, for the northern part of Ghana, and particularly among the Konkoma people where I had my research, women in particular had only their bedrooms to be their private spaces. So that is the only place that I could have interviews with them as a private spot. But the ethics board in a northern context will not understand this. So the fact that women host their guests in their bedrooms is a cultural thing. We cannot do without it. They cannot do without it. And that's very important for them. That's the only way they can guarantee their privacy. We need to understand this if we can have researchers do their research in a very important way. Then there is the issue of compensation. Compensation in the context of a poverty-ridden environment is very, very difficult. Now, in some contexts, somebody does not have something they will eat for the day. So if you decide to give them $1, it is enough to induce them to participate in a study. So if you say that I don't give too much to induce the person, what is too much in the context of that community? Too much is defined in the context of the ethics reviewer, but too much is not defined in the context of that community. And that becomes a difficult thing to do in doing that research. I've always said that for all the researches that I've conducted in Ghana in particular, I have breached this ethical requirement because the least dollar I give is enough to induce this person to participate in the study. So to what extent are we being ethically just in that perspective? It's really difficult. The last slide, pardon me, is obligation to report. Now, when you go into a space where people are you suspect abuse and you go and report, what you may be doing may be more harmful to the person you are seeking to protect than where there's poverty, governments are not resourceful enough to provide for protection mechanisms. Reporting is elevating the person's risk of harm to a certain level beyond what they already face. And so my concern is, do we go or come with some of these ethical requirements? This is my last slide, and I'll end it here. And then when questions come in, I believe we'll be able to do justice to the rest of the things that I would have rushed through. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Festus, for a really interesting body of work and research, and again, bringing us a lot to think about. We have a question immediately for you. Raising the hand is Matthew, who we heard from introducing today. Matthew, your question for Festus.
Thank you, Stéphanie, and thank you, Festus, for a wonderful presentation. I can relate to a lot of things that you have spoken about as somebody who is also doing research in the South. My question to you is, how do you imagine ethics governance from the global South, taking into consideration all these challenges that you have highlighted? How do you imagine ethical governance from the global South, if that were to be taken into consideration? Thank you.
Yeah, so when I was struggling with the ethics committee, one thing that I found useful was the support from my committee members. And when I empaneled my committee, my greatest fear was to put somebody who doesn't understand the context where I was going to be researching onto the committee. And I had somebody who I thought was understood the context. Along the line, I recognized the fact that they were a bit limited in their understanding of the context. And then I got them, we mutually parted ways. What I believe can happen is for ethics boards to be open to consulting people who have some expert knowledge. I'll put experts in inverted commas in respect for Simeon's presentation. Now, we may assume they do have those expert knowledges, and sometimes they do not. But some people who understand the context, if the ethics board can consult these people before taking their decisions on what is ethical and what is not ethical in specific applications, it will be helpful. Now, when I set out to conduct my study, I was going to research people with disabilities, severe forms of disabilities. And you and I know where I came from in terms of my study. But for those who do not know, I am disability heavy in terms of my research, and it's because my brother died out of a cultural practice that did not support people who had disabilities. So on suspicion that he had, he possessed, he was a spirit child. And so he had a developmental disability. I do my research on disability to honor him. And so when I went into the disability research, my aim was to interview people with developmental disabilities, just to understand their perspective. I put in my ethics application, and I'm told that I cannot interview these people unless I can prove that they have capacity to consent. So going back to what Kriti and her colleague presented on, whose voice gets heard is determined at the top level. I couldn't prove that they have capacity to consent because in Ghana, there's no assessment center to do that. The only assessment center itself needs some assessment to see if it does have any form of ability to do so. And so without the ability to assess for their capacity to consent, I wasn't able to carry out my research with these populations. I ended up dealing with people with physical disabilities, even that there were issues of disrespect for their personhood and their agency in some respect. I'm not sure I have time to talk about that, but back to your question, I believe that if somebody understood to the very barest minimum what it is to be able to assess somebody for their capacity in a Ghanaian context, they would have understood why I would conduct a study with people, knowing where I'm coming from, knowing how, in terms of my proposal and whatever I presented to them, they should be able to decipher between a harmful, somebody with an intention to extract and somebody with an intention to support a population group. So it's a lot to think about. There's no one way to think about it, but it's a conversation that we are putting forward. And for the podcast that I mentioned that I should be posting the links shortly, we are trying to follow up on that podcast with consulting ethics boards to see what they think we can do to ensure that some people do not get left out of the research process because of the ethical approval processes.
Thank you.
I feel like that's an entire topic in and of itself for a full day of discussion, and something that many people in this session would have indeed experienced and come up against, myself included, fighting with a number of ethical boards when it came to looking at some of my research into non-Western art musics, as that's my background and practice. And I just want to note that lengthy but beautiful sentence that you put in your conference guide, Festus, in saying that this is an overlooked area of colonization in academia itself, where knowledge is produced from the global south and it's been ignored, rejected, or intentionally silenced in what Gretsch and Goodley call the epistemological rejection. That in itself is something that I hope that we'll hear more from as well when it comes to your podcast. For everybody in the chat, Festus has just shared with you a podcast link, and I'm sure with the organisers will make that available to people as well if you don't have a chance to grab it. We have another question here from Kennedy. Kennedy, your question from Festus.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie, and thanks, Festus, for the very interesting presentation, as well as the preceding presenters who touch on some of the themes. And I also can relate with that issue, or with the issues that you raised, being situated in a global north institution, so to speak, but also conducting research in the global south. And having raised some of those issues, but also responded to some of the comment raised by Matthew, perhaps it will be quite interesting to hear your reflections on some of the innovative ways that you've managed to try to overcome some of these challenges, as that would be quite useful. Thanks.
Thank you. So as I've always said, most of my presentations, I don't have conclusions because I don't conclude. It's an ongoing project. So for me, there were some of these that I couldn't negotiate. So one of them is where I simply had to leave people off. And the challenge was I was already in Ghana waiting for ethics approval, and I couldn't stay in Ghana for far too long. And so, I thought there is a proverb in Ghana that he who fights and runs away will live to fight another day. So I thought that I would shelve that and then I'll come back. I believe in innovation, but sometimes I believe in pushing for what is right. So there were some of the instances I had to push for them to accept that we had to do this. One of them was to have the third party present in interviews. There was the other one that had to do with how people would consent in terms of the actual evidence of consent. Do they sign signatures? the ethics board wouldn't allow for them to thumb print. In Ghana and in most developing parts of the world, the first signature will be by a pen. The second one will be by the thumbprint. And I made provisions for thumbprint, and the ethics board would not allow for them to do thumbprint. They would rather that I took video or audio consents. Video consent was out of the way for me because of the nature of the topic that I was dealing with. And then audio consent for people to get to hear that you are taking this audio recording because you want to have evidence that they agree would push people off from participating. So it wasn't a goal area for me. I wouldn't get anybody to interview in that respect. So I had to push the ethics board to understand that that is the practice in the context that I was conducting the study, by providing literature evidence to the ethics board that this is what happens if somebody cannot sign with a pen. The next thing is to use a thumbprint. There is no such thing like video or audio consenting in the Ghanaian context, and they agree to that. Now, the other thing that I have had the support of is, as I mentioned earlier, the committee that you empaneled was useful to helping me as a student. But in the case you are working outside of the student status, is something that we need to think about. My committee would agree to whatever and sign off on my application process, and that was helpful for me to negotiate the ethics process. As I speak, you would hear a lot of students' experiences in my voice, and it is because I have just begun my tenure track position. And so I'm now experiencing the other side of it. I believe that it is the process that we are chartering with all these research processes that will help us to be able to come to a conclusion that this is more innovative to do, or this is that is more innovative to do. But I haven't been that innovative yet.
And we say yet because I'm sure you will be. And how lucky are those students to have you as a professor too, and their understanding and your understanding meeting in the future of their academic careers. We've got a question that's come through in message from Kriti. Kriti, are you there with your question for Festus?
Yeah, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's really a daunting task getting information from people with disability, as you mentioned that you cannot directly access them in many contexts. And we have to work through intermediaries. And while working through them, like, have you faced any challenges, like differences in what actually you want to get and what information you actually receive while working with the intermediaries?
Yeah, so most often when I do research, I've been involved with disability practice for quite some time. There are some of these things that I can find my way to extract information from people with certain types of disabilities. People with communication challenges have been, verbal communication challenges have been very difficult for me, and I've had to use interpreters to do that for me. And that has been the most daunting thing for me as a researcher. Sometimes the answers that the interpreter would give you may be a bit way off what you are expecting, and yet you do not have that ability to directly interact with the individual. So that is always there. What I've always done is to rephrase questions several times to get people to at least produce responses that I think would be closer to what I expect to be the responses. I have often not been in a rush when I interviewed people with disabilities, understanding that some of them need a lot of time to reflect and think through whatever they would give you. And some of them, by the nature of their disabilities, cannot particularly sit for too long. So taking longer breaks and short intermittent breaks that are long enough for them to recuperate and come back to you, and all those things are things that I've had to do to be able to get information to work with. I understand your question from the other perspective of what is the quality of the information that you will get from these people, these persons that you are working through intermediaries to be able to acquire information from. So for me, what we call member checking is very important for me when I interview people through intermediaries. The fact that you would have an opportunity to seek clarifications from them to confirm some of these things for you is what makes it very important for us to be able to represent their voices to as closely as possible to what they would have been expressing to us.
What a great response, and more thought-provoking information provided, better still. Now, we're reaching the end of our session today. I'm looking at the time, we've got a couple of minutes. Is there anybody else with a question or a comment that they weren't able to bring up until now? I think, Vincent, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so thanks, Festus. So I think it's like you rightly said, most of us who are researching, or most researchers whose research is based in the global south face similar or same issues and challenges. But I just want to take on this. Don't you think that all of these discrepancies and inequities and all of these challenges, ethical challenges, is as a result of the global south, for instance, not being able to come up with its own ethical framework or regulations such that they work hand in hand with those that are coming from the north? Because literally where I had my early schooling and early research in Ghana, for instance, I never came across such routine checks, routine ethical, screening until I came here, and I was like, whoa, this is just serious. And so I don't think that the global south also needs to really awaken to this reality and begin to frame its own ethical lens, such that it finds a way to embrace or to work hand in hand with that which comes from the north. Otherwise, the global north is going to persist, and I can't tell how long this is going to persist until there is an alternative or complementary framework from the south that would, help mitigate the situation. What is your take on that?
My take is exactly the same as yours. So you see, I think one of the Matthew's question is being answered by your question as much, that we need to start thinking about how to, for us who have had that experience, how do we support institutions back home to be able to put in place those structures? You rightly said, I conducted my master's dissertation on children with disabilities. I actually interviewed children with disabilities. I didn't go through ethics processes. I was talking to one of my friends who is in the University of McGill the other day, and he expressed the same concern as you did, and I've been pondering over that. I can't publish my master's dissertation in any serious journal because it didn't go through those ethics processes. And maybe I went in with a genuine intention. Somebody would go in with a different intention, and we can imagine what kind of harm that can be having on people in the ground, in the communities. So as you said, perhaps if we had policy statements guiding ethics in the global south, and if I wanted to apply to an ethics board and I constantly reference those policy statements, it would draw attention to whoever is evaluating my study that I would have done some checks to be able to put my house in order before coming through. Otherwise, could I apply to the ethics board in the country where I am going to be conducting my study? And when it is approved, then I then bring that into my institutional review processes here in Canada or in Australia or in the US for approval. Perhaps that would be a way to have us conduct our research without these limitations that we face because we solely go through ethics processes in the global north. Yeah, so thank you. That's a very laudable idea you raised there, Vincent.
Well, I believe we've come to the end of our panel session right now. But as I say, water to ground theory tells us it takes 3 days for deep-rooted water to raise itself to the surface, and about as many days for our brains to really come together and think about certain questions and responses. So whilst I'm not a fan of online sliding into the DMs, I will say that, it's really appropriate if you've been sparked in the conversation and presentation of our panelists today. Please do reach out to them and continue these conversations as well offline and in another guise. I want to thank our panelists today with Simeon Gready, with Donatien Niyonzima, and also Kriti, Bhuju, and finally Festus Moasun for their incredible presentations and for sparking much thought and perhaps even work for all of us to continue on with. Forward notifier here, you have about an hour's break before our next panel for this afternoon. That will start at 1 o'clock, and that is on diaspora with the chair of Dr. Tebeje Mola. And you have some great speakers there to look forward to as well. Farida Fodza, Tinashe Jacqua, and David Mikler, as well as Franca Vaughan and Guido Melo as your panelists in that talk. So you've got about an hour to go away, decompress, digest all of the things, have some lunch before rejoining us again at 1 o'clock. I'm Stéphanie Kabanyana Kanyandekwe. Thank you so much for your presence and for your attention this afternoon. Back to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the wonderful work and all the presenters and all participants. This was such an engaging panel, and I personally really enjoyed it, and I do hope everyone enjoyed it. As Stephanie has already said, it's time for break. We will reconvene at 1, and I wish you the best and enjoy your lunch, or those who are going to sleep, enjoy your night. Until then, see you soon.